The Ohio River ran black under the moonless sky, its waters carrying fragments of ice that clinked against the wooden pilings of the Cincinnati docks, like prisoners rattling their chains. On the Kentucky shore, barely visible through the fog, lanterns flickered in the windows of the Harmon plantation, a place locals whispered about, a place where the cruelties were so profound that even hardened slave catchers shook their heads and looked away. Marcus Webb stood at the window of the small print shop on Fifth Street, his calloused hands pressed against the cold glass. At 43, he bore the scars of 20 years in bondage across his broad back, memories etched in keloid tissue that still ached when winter settled over the city. 5 years had passed since he'd crossed this very river, hidden beneath burlap sacks in a coal barge, guided by a Quaker woman whose name he'd never learned and whose face haunted his dreams like an angel he could never properly thank. "You're thinking too loud," came a voice from behind him. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the back room, wiping ink from her fingers onto her apron. She was 31, small-framed but fierce, with eyes that had seen her husband sold away from her in a Richmond auction house 12 years prior. She'd walked to freedom, navigating by the North Star and the kindness of strangers, and had spent every day since helping others do the same. "The word came through today," Marcus said quietly, not turning from the window. "From Thomas. He managed to get a message out through one of the house servants who comes to market." Sarah's breath caught. Thomas Mitchell was her son, a son she'd been forced to leave behind when he was only 7 years old, too dangerous to bring on her desperate flight north. The Harmon plantation had purchased him 3 years ago, and since then, Sarah had moved heaven and earth trying to find a way to reach him. "What did he say?" 23 people in the work camp. Heigen Sophain's shackles, guard dogs, 2 overseers with rifles who sleep in shifts. But Sarah... Marcus finally turned to face her. "He says the main house is being renovated. Half the regular guards were sent to Louisville to escort a cotton shipment. It's now or never." The print shop had become an unofficial headquarters for Cincinnati's small but determined community of formerly enslaved people. While the city had its share of abolitionists, both black and white, it also harbored Southern sympathizers and slave catchers who prowled the streets looking for the hefty bounties offered for runaways. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, so they kept their planning circles tight. By midnight, 11 people had gathered in the shop's basement. Marcus and Sarah were joined by Daniel Freeman, a blacksmith whose massive arms could bend iron bars, Rebecca and Joshua Turner, a married couple who'd escaped from a Nashville plantation just 18 months prior, Elijah Stone, a young man of his 25 who taught himself to read and write in secret and now worked as a porter, and 5 others, each with their own story of chains and flight, each with their own reasons for risking everything to go back. "We'd be breaking the law," said Elizabeth Hayes, a woman of 50 who'd been free for 15 years. "The Fugitive Slave Act means they can arrest us even here in Ohio. And going into Kentucky, that's stepping right back into hell." "My son is in hell right now," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with steel. "Every day he wakes up in chains is another day his spirit dies. I won't wait for the law to save him. The law made him a slave in the first place." Joshua Turner spread a hand-drawn map across the work table. He'd been a coachman in Tennessee and knew the back roads and river crossings better than most. The Harmon place sits 2 miles inland from the Kentucky shore. There's a ravine that runs behind the slave quarters. Used to be a creek bed, dried up now. If we cross the river at Ludlow, we can approach from the east, stay in the tree line. And then what? Daniel asked, his deep voice rumbling. We can't fight off armed men. There might only be 2 overseers now, but you can be sure Harmon's got men in the main house. Marcus leaned forward. We don't fight unless we have no choice. We've got tools, we've got surprise, and we've got something they don't. We know what it's like to be desperate enough to do anything for freedom. Rebecca spoke up, her voice soft but clear. I can handle the dogs. I worked in the kennels before. Before Joshua and I ran, I know how to calm them, what commands they respond to. If we bring the right kind of meat, treated with valerian root, we can keep them quiet. The shackles are the real problem, Elijah said. He'd been taking notes, his neat handwriting filling the margins of Joshua's map. Iron shackles need keys or they need to be broken. We can't exactly bring a forge with us. Daniel smiled grimly. Don't need a forge, just need the right tools and knowledge of where the weak points are. I've studied enough chains to know how they break. They talked until dawn, began to grey the windows, working out every detail they could imagine and preparing for the ones they couldn't. They would need 3 boats, provisions, weapons, if absolutely necessary, and most critically, a safe route back. The Underground Railroad had stations scattered throughout Cincinnati, but bringing 24 people across the river would require coordination and resources beyond what any single household could provide. Sarah made contact with William Brisbane, a white abolitionist minister who'd freed his own slaves years before and who'd become a crucial ally. He was cautious but committed, and he agreed to have wagons ready at 3 different points along the river, each prepared to transport people to safe houses deeper in Ohio. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Marcus and Daniel worked in the blacksmith's forge, creating tools that could crack shackles without requiring excessive noise or time. Rebecca gathered herbs and prepared the dog-calming mixture. Elijah used his position as a porter to gather information about river patrols and ferry schedules. Sarah barely slept, her mind fixed on the image of her son's face. Would she even recognize him? He'd be 19 now, no longer the little boy she'd kissed goodbye in the darkness of a Virginia night. On the evening of March 18th, 1860, they gathered at the river bank. The temperature had dropped and a cold rain had begun to fall. Miserable weather for what they were about to attempt, but perfect cover for the sounds of oars in water. They wore dark clothing, their faces smeared with mud to reduce visibility. Marcus had never served in the military, but he imagined this was what soldiers felt before battle. That mixture of terror and determination, the sense that everything in your life had led to this single moment. The boats pushed off just after 10 o'clock. The rain intensified, which was both blessing and curse. It covered their approach, but made the river treacherous. Marcus sat in the lead boat, rowing with Daniel, both men's muscles burning as they fought the current. Behind them came the other 2 boats, each carrying 3 people and supplies. Kentucky loomed ahead, dark and silent. Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This land had been his prison once, and he was returning by choice. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd spent years running away from the South, and now they were running toward it, driven by something stronger than fear, love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that no one deserved to be property. They landed in a marshy inlet, pulling the boats into the cover of overhanging willows. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and through the darkness they could make out the faint glow of lights about 2 miles distant. The Harmon plantation. Moving in single file, they followed Joshua through the woods. The man had a supernatural sense of direction, navigating by moonlight and instinct through terrain he'd never actually walked before. The ravine appeared exactly where his map had suggested, a deep cut in the earth that provided cover as they approached the plantation. At 1 in the morning, they reached the edge of the clearing. The slave quarters were a row of dilapidated cabins, barely more than shacks, sitting in the shadow of the main house. A single lantern burned on the porch of a larger building, the overseer's quarters. They could see one man sitting there, a rifle across his lap, but his head was tilted back against the wall, sleeping or just resting. It was impossible to tell. Rebecca crept forward with her treated meat, moving like a ghost through the darkness. 2 dogs were chained near the cabins, and they stirred as she approached. For a heart-stopping moment, Marcus thought they would bark and ruin everything. But Rebecca made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, and the dogs' tails began to wag. She fed them the meat, scratching behind their ears, whispering words Marcus couldn't hear. The dogs lay down, and within minutes they were drowsy and compliant. Sarah and Elijah moved to the first cabin. The door wasn't locked. There was no need when the occupants were in chains. Inside, they found 6 men shackled to iron rings bolted into the wall. The men startled awake, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We're here to take you home," Sarah whispered. "To freedom. But you have to trust us, and you have to be silent." One of the men, Thomas, her son, she knew him instantly, despite the years and the scars and the beard, stared at her as recognition slowly dawned. His lips formed the word "Mama," but no sound came out. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Daniel went to work on the shackles, with Marcus holding the lantern low. The tools he'd designed worked perfectly, exploiting the weak points where the iron had been welded, applying pressure at precise angles. The sound was terrible, a grinding creak that seemed to echo across the plantation, but it was still quieter than breaking the chains would have been. One by one, the shackles fell away. The men rubbed their wrists, barely believing what was happening. They moved to the next cabin, then the next. 23 people, just as Thomas had said. Some were so weak they could barely stand. Others were injured, sick, brutalized by years of torture. But they all understood what was being offered, the chance to be free. And then everything went wrong. A woman in the 4th cabin, delirious with fever, cried out loudly when her shackles were removed, a sound of pain and relief that carried across the night air. The overseer on the porch jerked awake, his rifle coming up as he looked around wildly. "Go," Marcus hissed. "Everyone move now." They ran for the ravine, 23 freed people stumbling in the darkness, supported by the 11 who had come to save them. Behind them, shouts erupted. The overseer fired his rifle into the air. An alarm, rather than a shot, meant to kill. Lights began appearing in the main house windows. Marcus grabbed a young boy who'd fallen, hauling him up and pushing him forward. Sarah had Thomas by the arm, practically dragging him despite his size. Daniel brought up the rear, his massive frame shielding the others. A second shot rang out, this one closer. They heard horses neighing, men shouting orders. The plantation was waking up, and they were still 1.5 miles from the boats. "The ravine!" Joshua shouted. "Follow the ravine!" They plunged into the darkness of the dry creek bed, using its depth for cover. The rain started again, harder now, turning the ground to mud that sucked at their feet. Behind them, they could hear dogs. Different dogs, fresh ones, baying with the thrill of the hunt. "Keep moving," Marcus commanded. He'd taken a leadership role without planning to, his voice carrying authority born of desperation. "Don't stop for anything." A shot whined past his head, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. They were being pursued in earnest now. The men chasing them knew these woods, knew this ground. The freedom seekers' only advantage was their motivation. Behind them was slavery and death. Ahead was the possibility of life. Elizabeth Hayes stumbled and fell, crying out as she twisted her ankle. Joshua didn't hesitate. He scooped her up and carried her, never breaking stride despite her weight added to his own burden. Rebecca led a group of children, her voice calm and steady, even as bullets kicked up dirt around them. They burst from the ravine onto the riverbank, and for one horrible moment, Marcus thought the boats would be gone, discovered and taken or sunk. But they were there, right where they'd left them, hidden in the willows. "Get them in," he shouted. "As many as will fit." They began loading people into the boats, cramming bodies into spaces meant for half as many. The pursuing men were close now. Marcus could hear them crashing through the underbrush, could see the flash of lanterns between the trees. "Cast off!" Daniel roared as the last person tumbled into the third boat. They pushed away from the shore, oars digging frantically into the water. A line of men appeared on the riverbank, rifles raised. Marcus saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the shots, saw the water around them erupt with impacts. Someone in his boat screamed, hit, but not fatally. The current caught them, pulling them toward the Ohio shore, toward freedom. More shots. But they were harder to aim now, the rain and darkness and the increasing distance making accurate fire nearly impossible. Marcus rode until his arms felt like they would fall off, until his back screamed in agony, until the Kentucky shore was just a dark line behind them. The Ohio side materialized out of the rain. Brisbane was there, with his wagons, along with a dozen other abolitionists, both black and white, who'd come to help. They pulled the boats ashore and began loading people into the wagons with practiced efficiency. "Go," Brisbane shouted. "The slave catchers will be crossing soon. We need to get these people scattered before dawn." The wagons rolled off in different directions, each heading to a different safe house, each taking part of the group to ensure that if one was caught, the others would still have a chance. Marcus found himself in a wagon with Sarah, Thomas, and 6 others, jolting through the dark streets of Cincinnati, toward a house on the east side of the city. They reached the safe house, a modest home, owned by a black family named Johnson, just as dawn was breaking. The Johnsons ushered them inside without questions, having done this dozens of times before. They provided food, water, and most importantly, safety. In the kitchen, warmed by a wood stove and wrapped in dry blankets, Sarah finally held her son. Thomas wept, 12 years of separation and suffering pouring out of him. Around them, the others were experiencing their own reunions, with freedom, with humanity, with hope. "Did everyone make it?" Marcus asked quietly, accepting a cup of hot coffee from Mrs. Johnson. "One man was shot," she replied. "He'll live, but he needs a doctor. William is arranging that. 3 others are at different houses. Some will stay in Cincinnati, some will continue to Canada. It's their choice now. Their choice. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time in their lives, these 23 people would have choices. Where to live, what work to do, whom to love, whether to stay or go. All of it, finally, theirs to decide. The newspapers the next day carried the story. The Cincinnati Enquirer, sympathetic to Southern interests, called it a brazen theft of property by criminal-colored elements. But the Philanthropist, the abolitionist paper, celebrated it as a heroic act of liberation, reminiscent of Moses leading his people from bondage. The truth, Marcus thought, as he read the accounts, was simpler than either version. It was people saving people. It was refusing to accept that anyone deserved to be enslaved. It was looking across a river and deciding that the risk of death was worth the possibility of freedom. In the weeks that followed, the 11 who had crossed the river became both celebrated and hunted. Reward posters went up, offering substantial sums for their capture. They had to be careful, had to watch for slave catchers who prowled Cincinnati streets with increasing boldness. The Fugitive Slave Act made them vulnerable even in free territory. But something had changed in the city. The daring rescue had inspired others, had proven that direct action was possible, that formerly enslaved people didn't have to wait for white abolitionists or political processes to save their loved ones. Other raids were planned, other groups were freed. Cincinnati became a more dangerous place for slaveholders who brought their human property across the river, never sure if they might be confronted by people willing to fight for freedom. Thomas Mitchell recovered slowly, both physically and mentally. The scars of his imprisonment would never fully fade, but with his mother's support and the embrace of the free black community, he began to build a new life. He learned to read from Elijah, worked in Daniel's forge, and eventually became part of the Underground Railroad himself, helping to guide others to freedom. On a warm evening in June, 6 months after the raid, the group gathered again in the print shop basement. All 11 were there, along with many of those they'd freed. They raised glasses, some containing whiskey, others water or cider, in a toast. "To freedom," Marcus said simply. "To freedom," they echoed, their voices blending. Together, different tones, different stories, but united in their shared understanding of what that word truly meant. Outside, the Ohio River flowed on, its waters carrying commerce and secrets, separating slavery from freedom by a distance you could almost throw a stone across. But the distance between bondage and liberty, they all knew, was far greater than any river. It was measured in courage, in sacrifice, in the willingness to risk everything for the chance to be fully human. The story of the Harmon Plantation raid spread through the underground networks, carried by word of mouth from safe house to safe house, from one group of freedom seekers to another. It became part of the larger narrative of resistance, one more example of enslaved and formerly enslaved people taking their destiny into their own hands. Years later, after the Civil War had torn the country apart and Reconstruction had begun its difficult work, Sarah Mitchell would tell this story to her grandchildren. She would describe the fear and the rain and the sound of rifles in the darkness. But most of all, she would tell them about the moment when the shackles fell away, when 23 people stood up as free men, women, and children, when the impossible became real because people decided it must be so. Remember, she would tell them, that freedom isn't given. Sometimes it has to be taken. And the people who take it are the ones brave enough to cross the river, to face the dogs and the guns and the law itself, because love is stronger than chains and hope is more powerful than fear. The night of March 18th, 1860, became a legend in Cincinnati's black community, a reminder that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when driven by conviction and compassion. The print shop on 5th Street continued its work, producing pamphlets and papers that spread the abolitionist message. The safe houses continued to shelter those fleeing bondage, and the people who had crossed the river that rainy night continued their work, knowing that one raid, one rescue, one act of defiance wasn't enough, but it was something. It was a beginning, and sometimes beginning is everything.